The First Blacks of Canada, Part 1. If you have ever consulted a Canadian history textbook, teacher, or Google about the first ever recorded black person in Canada, you will have undoubtedly been introduced to one of these two individuals, or possibly both. Mathieu Da Costa or Olivier Le-Jeune. But what if I told you that neither of these incredibly renowned characters were the first blacks in Canada? Likewise, what if neither the Black-Loyalists nor the Underground Railroad refugees were the first large populations in the country we currently call Canada? Don't believe me? Good. Never believe anything without evidence. Let's start with a boy called Olivier Le-Jeune. Best estimates place young Oliver's birth in 1621. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, at roughly age 6, Olivier was sold to his first owner by the slave trading pirate David Kirk. His new owner gave little relevance to Olivier's story except to bestow on the young boy his own name, Olivier. The surname of the enslaved boy, Le-Jeune, wasn't ever even a name at all. It was an epithet. That's a descriptive tag, and it means the young in French. The more one examines the story of Olivier Le-Jeune, the sketchier the details become. Take his ownership roster, which begins with two unnamed henchmen of David Kirk handing him over to Kirk while newly occupying the town of Tadoussac in 1629. There are no first-hand counts of him prior to this point. Within that same year, he is sold to Olivier Le Bailiff. It is unclear if this Le Bailiff is a name or a title, leading us to inquire more into this person and a potentially older slave trade. It must be noted that last names in this time were often both a name and a title. If the short length of time that Olivier stayed within the care of the bailiff is any indication, it is likely that Luke Bailiff was in fact a slave broker prior to this point, whom immediately sells him to Guillaume Quillard, whom effectively leases the boy out to priest Paul Le-Jeune, where he is raised fairly consistently and described only as a servant and never as a slave. He receives a thorough education in French and Latin along other indigenous Innu. Lastly, he is adopted along with two other indigenous girls into the care of Olivier. Le-Tardif. Some sources state that this owner, rather than the first Olivier, is where Olivier acquired his name, although this is highly unlikely. However, it seems that Olivier not much older than Louise Quillard, both daughter of previous owner Guillaume Quillard and wife of Olivier Le-Tardif, his final recorded owner. This owner, however, is only ever listed as an adopter. While this adoption was as a result of Paul Le-Jeune's poor health, although this too is highly questionable. If Olivier Le-Jeune was indeed a slave, as is repeatedly asserted, why wasn't his ownership passed back to his actual owner, Guillaume, when his teacher, Paul Le-Jeune, fell ill? Why was he so highly educated? Why educate him at all? Where's the mention of any of his duties? Why was he adopted as one of three indigenous, along with Marie Olivier Manitoulin, by his final owner, Olivier Le-Tardif? Poor Olivier would only live until the approximate age of 31, without his official legacy satisfying these glaring conflicts. Now here's where we run into a whole different set of logistics problems. Most sources state that young Olivier was stolen from Madagascar. This is because this is what pirate David Kirk told his client. There's also a baseless claim made recently of Olivier originating in Guinea, but it's bound to no evidence whatsoever and thus is dismissed without serious consideration. The only problem with Kirk's Madagascar assertion is that it was a lie. How do we know it was a lie? Well, to those unfamiliar with African geography, Madagascar seems unremarkable, but to any of us with even the vaguest understanding of Africa, instantly red flags are raised. Firstly, Madagascar doesn't even touch the Atlantic. It sits comfortably in the Indian Ocean, roughly 3 months away by contemporary sailboats of the day, and that's only one way. Thus, we are looking at a 6-month round-trip voyage from Quebec to Madagascar. That is not to mention hurricane seasons and the general treacherousness of the ocean voyage for a single slave. Alternatively, the boy could have crossed hands over a dozen times. But not only does the high death rate among slaves and sheer distance make this highly implausible, but the lack of a substantial slave trade infrastructure in 1629 and earlier would have prevented this entirely. Additionally, proponents of Pirate Kirk's lie must also contend with the reality that the only Europeans to visit Madagascar at this point in history were the Portuguese, and that their records negate the apprehension of any slaves. When we consider the proud exploits of Gaspar Corte Real and his brothers in Takatuk, we are reminded that the Portuguese did not omit the taking of slaves out of shyness or moral opposition. The French wouldn't invade the island of Madagascar until 1642, while it was little if at all known to the British. It would have been theoretically possible for Pirate Kirk to have retrieved the young soul from Arab slave traders, though. However, their trade really focused on the Indian Ocean. Therefore, for the single 6-year-old boy to have been sold into Kirk's service, he would have had to survive the long trek across the Sahara to some friendly French or English port on the West African coast, a port which had yet to exist in this time. Indeed, the conventional account demands any of these tremendously implausible scenarios be given precedence over the historically documented truth. What's that you say? Documented truth. That's right. After Black Bart and the fictitious Jack Sparrow, pirate David Kirk is probably the most documented villain to ever sail the ocean seas. We have extensive documents accounting for Pirate Kirk's life, because Kirk wasn't only a pirate. He was also awarded a lordship by his buddy Charles I of England. Not only was Sir Slave Trading Kirk a lord, but he was also awarded the first sole governorship of the entire island of Takankka, which the British would come to call Newfoundland for his heinous crimes in Tadoussac, and at no point had Kirk the time or opportunity to acquire Olivier from Madagascar. On the 17th of July, 1628, the British, through their heinous hired henchmen, led by Frenchman Pirate Kirk, attacked the Innu port town of Tadoussac in an effort to capture the Innu, who were thought of as spoils of war, and to dispel the French presence from the area. While no illicit notes describe the apprehension of the Innu boy, it is during this period precisely, while Kirk is known to be the despot of Tadoussac, that Kirk comes into possession of and sells off the mysterious Olivier Le-Jeune. Why then lie about Olivier Le-Jeune's ethnicity, you ask? Frankly, any number of reasons. For one, the favor of the day, and really any day, is exoticism. As a rule, slave from a far distant land, especially one from the very brink of the explored world, will be likely to fetch a prettier penny than a local dime a dozen run-of-the-mill local. Second, the French were allies of the Innu, and would be reluctant to buy a slave who might garnish the anger or worse turn an ally into an aggressor. Three, this lie could have been a ploy to incite violence between the Innu and French. Fourth, fearing the sublimest Deus Papal Bull, issued by Pope Paul III in 1537, which excommunicated Catholics that owned indigenous Americans, but preserved the ownership of African slaves, was yet another reason to lie. Fifth, Africans were rumored to make bigger and better slaves than indigenous Americans. Whatever Pirate Kirk's incentive to lie, and there are many, after honest consideration of the evidence, it remains clear to us in the modern day that Pirate Kirk certainly did so. Especially when we consider Olivier Le-Jeune was apprehended during the siege on Tadoussac. He had no route to Canada from Madagascar. European slavery did not exist in Madagascar. He attended an all-Innu school where his teacher describes him as eagerly content and a joy to teach. This does not sound like a young boy recently torn from his local environment and dragged kicking and screaming across two oceans, in a continent far from everyone and everything he knew and loved. Olivier Le-Jeune is absolutely unfamiliar with Islam, though Madagascar had been Muslim for over 600 years at this point. He is adopted into Olivier Tardif's family with two Innu sisters in 1633 without significant consequence. And what should be the nail in the coffin of this issue is that Olivier Le-Jeune is described as the indigenous adoptive son of his father, the well-versed Innu linguist Olivier Tardif. As such, it is incumbent on us in this generation to right the wrongs of cultural misappropriation that have erroneously robbed Olivier and all others like him of their indigenous heritage, by attributing his strong indigenous perseverance to the well-documented and unique African experience. Doing so undermines indigenous challenges and therefore the achievements of indigenous people within our own continent, and contributes wildly to our continued oppression. If you appreciated this exploration into Algonquin history and want to promote this kind of content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you are of Vlnug Heritage, register and be the solution for all our generations. Live life loud. Live life Vlnug. Apogee.